everyone, and welcome back to the Wellness Space. This is part 2 of the Transitioning to a Plant-Based Diet workshop series, and this video will be focused on common misconceptions of a plant-based diet. If you haven't seen number 1, I will link it in the description box below, but other than that, let's get to it. So, the first thing I want to talk about is protein. A lot of people think that it's difficult to get protein in a plant-based diet, or some people even think it's essentially non-existent. But protein comes in a lot of different foods, and in plant-based foods it can be in the form of beans, lentils, different types of legumes, nuts and seeds, even vegetables contain protein. The recommended amount of protein is 0.75 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So for example, if you were 100 kilograms, you would have 75 grams of protein per day to meet your requirements, which is actually not as much as you think it is. I'll put in a little picture from Viva of all the different foods that you can eat that are high in protein. But one thing that I really want to point out is that whilst you can get an abundance of different types of protein in a plant-based diet, the main thing to focus on, most plant-based foods don't contain the complete set of amino acids that you need, the essential amino acids for a healthy diet. But an easy way of getting around this is by consuming 2 different types of these protein sources in either your meal or at very least throughout the day, because all of them have different types of amino acids in, and when you combine 2 together, you generally get the full set that you need. The great thing is that plant-based proteins have been shown to be generally healthier than their meat alternatives. And this is particularly true when you look at different nuts and seeds. A lot of people, when they either think of a plant-based diet or when they try to go towards a plant-based diet, they simply remove the meat or dairy product from their meal. And that is essentially removing your protein from the meal. You still need to eat protein. So it's really important to make sure you're replacing that protein with these plant-based protein sources so that you're still getting the recommended daily amount. As well as protein, there are other really important nutrients in a plant-based diet. I'll be discussing that in part 3 of this series. The second misconception that I get all the time is that a plant-based diet is restrictive, and depends which way you look at it, because essentially it is. You're restricting certain amounts of food from your diet, you're choosing not to eat those foods, right? However, and I'm sure a lot of people who might be watching this who are already transitioning or have transitioned to a plant-based diet will agree with me, is that since transitioning, especially during the transition period, I have tried more foods than I ever did eating a meat and dairy diet. And this is because of a few things, but mostly it's because when you eat meat and dairy, you tend to stick to the same meals, you tend to eat the same foods that you were given when you were growing up, and you continue that into adulthood. You find the meals that you like, and that's pretty much it. But then when you go to transition to plant-based, you need to learn a whole new way of eating. You have to learn a whole new skill, a different way of cooking and everything. And that requires you to try lots of new and different types of foods. You need to source foods with different flavors to make a really nice, healthy, but also tasty meal. So you end up trying loads of these different foods, and actually often what happens is you eat more foods than you ever did before, more variety, more flavors. And so in that way, I think that it's not restrictive at all. It's actually releasing you from this sort of rut, if you like, of eating all your life. Also, as plant-based eating is rapidly becoming more and more popular, there is an abundance of plant-based alternatives. So where you find a meat burger, you will find a plant-based burger. Even things like a cinnamon bun, you can find a plant-based cinnamon bun. There is so many alternatives that so far I haven't found one thing that I can't get as a plant-based alternative. So when you look at it like that, maybe a few years ago it was restrictive, but now you can continue to eat the exact same diet if you wanted to as you currently do. So that is clearly not a restrictive diet at all. And in part 4 of this transition to a plant-based diet series, I do include some easy swaps, easy alternatives, not just your supermarket processed alternatives, but also your whole foods plant-based alternatives that you can do to switch up those foods in your meals to remove some of the meat and dairy and replace it with plant-based. And this is whether you want to be completely plant-based or whether you just want to include a few more things in your diet to maybe make it a bit healthier, maybe reduce your environmental impact, that kind of thing. The next thing is something I find quite funny, is that a lot of people think that a plant-based diet is tasteless or it's just salads, and that it couldn't be further from the truth. Yes, you might learn to love a really good salad where you didn't before, because when you remove the meat from your diet, and this is something that I've experienced as well as I've spoken to other people and they've experienced the same thing, is that after it's been removed, your taste changes, your taste buds change. You seem to appreciate the flavors of the vegetables more, and the fruit and the plant-based alternatives more, and therefore generally you do tend to like things like salads a lot more. But it's not just salads. You can make every single meal that is a meat version into a plant-based version. Even things like they have steaks these days, if that's something that you want to do. But in your general meals, your pastas, your spaghetti bolognese, your curries, there's so much variety of foods that you can have that isn't just salads, and they are full of flavour. Because when you start to cook in a plant-based way, you rely less on the flavour of the meat and you rely more on the flavour of things like herbs, spices, garlic, toppings such as like a really good olive oil, that kind of thing. And actually the food, in my opinion, becomes more flavourful because you're including all these extra flavours, combining them together, experimenting, making some really tasty dishes. And there are some countries, I think, that do this really well naturally, even if they don't mean to. They're not trying to be plant-based, but they do this really well, and that's places, especially in Asian countries, including places like India, where they use a lot of spices and herbs, and they make these really flavorful dishes regardless of whether it's meat or vegetables in that dish. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about, it's slightly a larger topic, is that a plant-based diet is not filling. I can see why people have come to this conclusion, especially when maybe they've tried to go plant-based, or they've simply just had meals in the past where they haven't had meat or dairy in them, and you know, they've gotten hungry just a couple of hours after eating that meal. And there are a few reasons for this, and also a few things that you can do to prevent this from happening. One of them is protein satiety. So I discussed before about protein and making sure that you do replace the protein in your foods when you remove, say, the meat from your foods, to replace it with an alternative protein, plant protein source. The reason for this partly is that protein is the macronutrient in the diet that gives the highest satiety. So that means that it makes you feel full, it makes you want to stop eating, and it makes you feel fuller for longer. So there is a common myth that plant-based foods aren't filling, because when people simply remove the meat from their diet, they don't replace it with a plant-based alternative, they're going to feel hungry really quickly because that food's going to metabolize really quickly, and It's not giving them that full feeling. So making sure that you have that plant-based alternative of protein is really important. In addition to that, plant-based proteins tend to also come with higher amounts of carbohydrates in them, and carbohydrates are the ones that are going to keep you feeling fuller for longer. So you've got that protein in those plant-based foods that are making you feel full when you eat the meal immediately, and then you've got those carbohydrates that are going to keep you feeling full for the rest of the day. The next thing I want to point out is the dense calories of meat. So meat is a lot more dense in calories than a lot of other plant-based foods. So a less volume of meat is required to gain the same amount of calories as if you were gonna have a plant-based protein alternative. So when you switch to a plant-based diet, or even just switch one thing in your meal, you've got to remember that probably the amount of the volume of food that you need to replace that with is going to be a lot larger than like maybe a small chicken breast. You're going to have a much larger portion of the plant-based alternative because it's generally lower in calories. So your portion sizes are really important in this case. Your portion sizes of a plant-based meal might look a lot bigger than a portion size of a meat-based meal. A common mistake is to keep the same portion size. Then you're going to feel hungry quicker because you're not having as much calories. You might even lose weight, and that's when we get into those some negative effects of the plant-based diet that many people do experience, but often it's because of these things that they haven't quite realized when switching to a plant-based diet, that they need to make changes to their diet. They can't just remove the meat. It's as much about switching as it is about learning a new skill. And like with anything, learning a new skill is hard at first. You have to put effort in, but after a while it becomes a habit or it becomes the norm, and then it's easy for you. It won't be complicated forever. One thing I also like to say is the vegetables are unlimited. And whilst there's always going to be some kind of limit to this, in general, vegetables are very low calorie compared to the amount of nutrients they have within them. As long as they aren't covered in like oil or salt, you can pretty much consider veg unlimited. If you feel hungry, have an extra portion of veg in that plant-based meal. Or if you feel hungry a few hours later but it's not time for the next meal yet, have a vegetable snack. So have like carrot sticks and hummus. Carrot sticks are great vegetables. They have a lot of nutrients, and then the hummus is then chickpeas. Hummus is basically chickpeas, so then that's another protein source. So you've got that extra healthy protein and vegetable snack that will then keep you going for the rest of the day. It's not a bad thing to snack if you need the food, if you need those calories, because if you let yourself get too hungry, you're just going to binge later on during the day. The fact that vegetables are so low in calories for their volume but so high in nutrients makes me believe that they are all truly superfoods. I know we tend to focus on one particular vegetable depending on what's in the media at that time as being a superfood, but actually I think all of them are. They are all abundant in nutrients and minerals, and we can eat so much of them. And then the last sort of section to this is that the body probably just isn't used to it yet. If a person's been eating a certain way for 30, 40, even 50 years, your body is going to be used to eating that way, and this is down to a physiological level. The gut's going to contain the type of acid and bacteria and enzymes needed to digest those types of foods that you continue to consume every single day. When you change your diet at first, the body's going to have difficulty digesting these foods because these plant-based foods tend to be higher in fiber and they are more nutrient dense. So the types of enzymes needed to digest these foods are probably going to be very low in numbers compared to what's needed to digest them fully. In addition, the cells in the gut wall may not be used to absorbing all these different types of nutrients. So this can cause problems such as stomach pain, it can cause wind, it can cause feeling of tiredness, and it can even cause things like skin problems during the first few weeks of changing this diet. And I do say weeks, it can take quite a long time. So I would say stick with it. That's probably one of the best pieces of advice I can give. It's one of the reasons that I named this series Transitioning to Plant-Based Diet, because I don't think it's something that's necessarily good to do just overnight. I think it's best to slowly increase these types of foods into your body over a long period of time where your body can get used to them, and it's not going to be such a shock to the system. Not only that, if you do it more slowly, you're less likely to rebound. So you're less likely to have those cravings for meat or dairy or animal products. You're going to be more used to a plant-based diet over a slow period of time, rather than suddenly quitting and then craving those foods just the next few days. If you do experience these kind of GI upset issues, and this continues from weeks into months, then I would consider seeking advice from a nutritionist, a dietitian, or your GP. Another thing that can help with these GI issues is taking a probiotic. They can come in the form of tablets or also fermented foods. So this might be kombucha, kimchi, tempeh, soy sauce, sauerkraut, those kind of fermented foods. There are also versions of vegan yogurts that contain probiotics as well. Probiotics can provide the gut with a healthy bacteria. This bacteria assists with the breakdown of these foods. So it's the type of bacteria your gut needs to break down plant-based foods, as opposed to the meat and dairy that you may have been consuming before. When you eat a lot of meat and dairy, generally have a different ratio of bacteria or different types of bacteria in your stomach than you do if you eat a plant-based diet. A lifetime of eating unhealthily can cause an imbalance in the type of bacteria that grows in the gut, and probiotics can be a remedy to help for this. From my personal experience, I didn't even intend to go plant-based. I intended simply just to reduce my meat and dairy intake, and this process took me about a whole year. I gradually switched out milk to start with, tried loads of different types of plant-based milks because, to be honest, at first I really didn't like them, but after trying them for a period of time I eventually got used to them and found which ones were my favourites. And then I started to reduce other things like my meat. I started to choose the plant-based alternatives over the meat alternatives. I even tried cooking up a few new types of meals from different recipes from people online. And then eventually the only thing I was eating was things like chocolate, occasional things with cheese in, because I really loved cheese. And then eventually I decided to try just going vegan for a month and never looked back. And that process took me a whole year. And I think if I had tried to do it any quicker, I would have just started eating meat again, because it's a whole new skill. It's not just removing meat and dairy from your diet. It's learning to replace that with healthy alternatives that are going to make you feel full, that feel good for your body, and learning how to cook those alternatives as well. It tends to be more of learning how to cook and how to make food flavorful and filling, as opposed to just swapping out and buying a plant-based burger from the supermarket. You can do it that way, but it's generally more expensive just to simply buy the alternatives, and also generally unhealthier because the foods tend to be more processed. So I think that's everything for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Do subscribe if you find it helpful. There's lots more of these types of videos on here and lots more to come. Do press like if you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, as that lets me know that this kind of content is helping people, and that's the main thing I want to do. If I can just help one person, that will make me happy. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in part 3. Bye!